God morgen, boker tov. Good morning. I really hope that you have slept well tonight. Actually, I didn't. And this is actually no laughing matter, because I made the big mistake of going in on Facebook last night, just before trying to go to sleep. And then I'm very sorry, I read an article by a man called Bernd Hagtvedt, whom you don't know, but he's a historian, and it was perhaps the worst anti-Semitic, anti-historic piece I've ever read. It was absolutely shocking, so I really couldn't sleep. I'm sorry about that. But it just tells us that we have a long way to go, that this piece was published in a, well, somewhat respected newspaper like Klassekampen. The only consolation I have is that I'm 100% certain that this guy, Bernd Hagtvedt, tried to have it published in Aftenposten first. But he didn't succeed. He had to go to Klassekampen. So, but this means the agenda is long and the hour is late. And one of the main topics we have to fight in our society, in Norway, I think perhaps more than in many other countries, is what does international law, what does agreements say about the situation? What is an occupation? Is it legal or isn't it legal? What is genocide? In legal terms, these are difficult questions that really concerns us all. We know we have a war going on in our vicinity in Europe. What are these things, and what is the truth? One thing is what is happening, another thing is what is the law. I struggled with this as a lawyer for many years. I'm not an expert. But lo and behold, we do have an expert in the room, Eugene Kontorovich. And he really knows this field, and I'm really looking forward to hearing what he has to tell us about international law and what it says about the borders of Israel and what they can and cannot do. I give you Eugene Kontorovich, please.
Thank you so much for having me here. Thank you, Conrad, for organizing this. And it's really deeply moving to me to see all of you here on a Sunday morning, not even the first day of the conference, to try to learn not what you read in the newspaper, not the conventional wisdom about some of the most important issues in the day. And it's very touching. I can tell you, when Conrad contacted me and asked me, to come speak here, he said there's this Nordic pro-Israel conference. I said, listen, you better rent the biggest telephone booth in Oslo for the audience. And so seeing all of you here is it's a testament that I think minds can be changed, and I think it's important to know the facts, to change other people's minds. And right now I'm going to be speaking about the basic question of territory, occupation, what is occupied territory, what borders are Israel entitled to. And I'm not going to speak about it from the perspective of history or from the perspective of religion or from the perspective of morality, but from the very particular perspective of international law, which, by the way, need not coincide with any of those other things. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. But I think, in particular, this is very important in a country like Norway, which I believe takes as a kind of national commitment the promotion of international rules and international order. and does see a kind of moral value to international law. And what I'm going to say is international law is an important way of understanding the Israeli-Arab conflict, but you have to get the international law right. And there's a few dangers about discussing. So first of all, let me say there's almost no conflict in the world that is so routinely discussed in international legal terms as the Israeli-Arab conflict. That is to say, when newspapers talk about the Turkish occupation of European territory in northern Cyprus, which is very rarely, but when they do, they say there's the Turks, there's the Greeks, the Cypriots. The Turks are controlling some territory, but they don't use legal terminology like occupation. I've done a big study of this. Most of the people now in northern Cyprus have come from Turkey. They're never called Turkish settlers. They don't use this language. There's two sides. They have different disputes. So international law is used almost uniquely as a mode of discourse in discussions of Israel and its borders. And it poses a challenge. What's the challenge? How many people here are lawyers? Well, okay, that's normal. In a Jewish group, it would be higher. But most people are not lawyers. And most lawyers, 99.999% of lawyers, are not international lawyers, because there's really not much money in it. So when claims are made about international law, we need to understand that it's a claim up to an esoteric body of knowledge. That is to say, a specialized body of knowledge that only a small priestly class possesses, and so you have to really trust these priests, and it's good to check them sometimes also, to make sure that what they're saying makes sense. And so once you move the conversation into international law, you're moving to a conversation where most people simply are not equipped to deal with it. No, that's not an insult. That's normal. There's no reason you should. Okay. I'm starting with a few methodological points. Second methodological point is when people do think or hear or talk about international law, occupation. When you hear occupation, what do you think? Do you think the occupation? Do you think of the Turkish occupation of northern Syria, where an area with close to 1 million Kurds in it is occupied by Turkey, or the Moroccan occupation of Western Sahara? Maybe you think Crimea. Do you think about Abkhazia or Ossetia? What are these places? So the discussion is so focused about Israel that no one has a frame of reference, comparisons. And that's very important for international law, for any kind of law. Because what is law? Law is a system of general rules. General means there are rules that are made without knowing who's going to be involved in a dispute, that then gets applied to future disputes. You make the rules before you know who the parties are. And you figure out the rules by looking at precedent, what happened before. Right? Norway is not a common law country, but I assume they do the same thing here, right? The courts, if they want to figure out the rules, they look at what happened in previous cases. That's usually how it works. But if you only know about one case, you've created a legal universe of one. So, again, there's much to say here, but I want to tell you, because you're going to go out there and you're going to have conversations with people. I can't tell you all the things about Israel and international law, because Israel's constantly everything Israel does is supposedly against international law. But what I want to do is give you at least a methodology. When you hear a claim about Israel, what Israel is doing, conduct X, violates international law, violates rule Y. your first instinct should be, can you show me some other examples in similar situations where this rule that you claim exists was applied? So for example, let me give an example. If someone says it's illegal for Jewish settlers to live in the occupied West Bank, you should say, can you give me an example somewhere else in the world where international law, everyone agreed that it was illegal for a group based on their ethnicity to live in a particular geographic area? Is there one such example? By the way, if they're smart, they would have other examples, because there are other examples. So it is not the case that Jews living in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria, is the only time the international community has said that it's wrong for people of a certain ethnicity to live in a certain place. Here there are other examples. This is what the international community also said about Jews living in the Sinai after 1967, Jews living in Gaza, Jews living in Jerusalem, and Jews living in Golan. So there are other precedents. So to be more specific, you need to say, can you give me a non-Jew example? With no Jews in it? Thank you. Again, people think occupation is a bad thing. And again, there's just a very little familiarity with international law. Does anyone know when the occupation of Berlin ended? 1990. 1990, very good. With the fall of the Berlin Wall, the end of the Cold War, the end of the Soviet Union. Berlin was from 1945 to 1990 an occupied territory. The Federal Republic of Germany became an independent country. Berlin was not part of that country. It was separately administered by the Allies. And that could have gone on for 1,000 years if the Soviet Union had not collapsed. There was no end date. Right? Did anybody ever say that Americans or Brits or French were not allowed to move to West Berlin because it was occupied? No, Americans don't go to West Berlin. No one even heard of such a thing. Can I tell? And I'm a law professor, and I looked long and hard. No one even wrote a law review article suggesting such a thing. And that's amazing, because law professors, we're supposed to be constantly publishing things, right? Do you see what I'm saying? Always making new things. They don't really care how well you teach, but you have to always make new articles. And so every idea that's even not totally crazy has been written about. No one even wrote an article saying maybe there's a problem with Americans moving to West Berlin. Okay. So those are some background principles. You need to be aware. Notice I haven't said a thing about Israel yet. Because you don't learn the rules that get applied to a particular case by learning the case itself. You need to look outside of the case and say, what are the general rules? So now we're going to turn to Israel, but I'll set up some basic principles. If we were to say, what are Israel's borders? What are the borders of Israel? Where did Israel get its borders? I think a lot of people would say the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution in 1947 with borders. And that created Israel or gave Israel its borders. So we need to think critically about this. This is not the case, but you should first ask yourself. That's what I call an Israel-specific answer. An answer where you're looking at the case and seeing the facts, not looking what are the general principles. So for example, how do we know, since when did the United Nations create countries? Can anyone name another country created by the United Nations? Was Norway created by the United Nations? Is that a thing? Since when does the United Nations General Assembly create borders for countries? Remember, the United Nations General Assembly has a majority of countries that are very undemocratic and anti-Western. America wouldn't have any borders if they could just have a vote of the majority at the General Assembly. Indeed, you have to first ask, what's the rule? Is there a thing that the General Assembly can make borders for countries? No. How do we know? Because the General Assembly is created by the UN Charter. It's part of the United Nations. The Constitution of the United Nations is what gives the General Assembly powers. It doesn't automatically have powers. In international law, power all comes from countries. Countries are the top-level actors. And they can only be bound to rules that they make. So they make a treaty like the UN Charter. The UN will only have the powers given to it by the countries that are members. What is the only power the General Assembly has? To approve its own budget, which it does very well every year. But the General Assembly is not a legislature. It looks like a legislature. We're going to go to a real legislature later today, the parliament. That's a legislature. But the fact that they all sit around in like seats in one thing and another does not mean they're both legislatures. Why does the legislature of Parliament of Norway have power? Because the Constitution of the Kingdom of Norway gives them power. Why does the General Assembly not have power? Because the UN Charter does not give them power. It's a place for them to get together and talk. It's purely political and diplomatic. And the fact that they issue legal-sounding documents doesn't change that. What I'm saying so far is entirely not controversial. This is basics. But that means if the United Nations passed a resolution saying these should be the borders, it has no legal status. And by the way, they knew that. How do we know that they knew it? Read the resolution, 181. They don't say we're creating a country, a Jewish state, or we're creating these borders. They say we recommend. This is our it was a proposal. You know, with United Nations resolutions, the most important thing, tell me if, by the way, if my English is too fast or too much. The verb. Everything. The most important thing is the verb in a Security Council resolution. So, for example, in a UN resolution would say, condemning Syrian use of chemical weapons against their people, or condemning in the strongest possible terms the construction of apartments for Jews in Jerusalem. So the verb is the key thing. The verb in 181, in 1947, was recommend. They say, look, we understand if a Jewish state is created, the Arab population has already threatened great violence against the Jews. It was universally believed in 1947 that the Jews would lose that conflict, and there would be like a second Holocaust. Everyone felt a little bad about that. So they said, hey, we'll suggest a deal. Split it up in a complicated way. So what is that has no legal status. Not because we don't like it, but because you should know the rule before, right? Does the UN General Assembly make borders? No. If both sides had agreed to it, it would be binding, because in international law, countries can, by consent, basically create new rules and new realities for themselves, new legal obligations. But in fact, the Arab side did not consent to that. So we can throw that out as a candidate for borders. So then how do we figure out the borders of Israel? I want to throw that question out. I want to take one step back. Because you should not approach this by thinking, what are the borders of Israel? You should say, how do we figure out the borders of a new country? A new country. That is to say, a country is created where not a new government of an existing country, but a new country which can be created, they're created fairly often. Right? In 1945, the UN had 50-something members. Now it has 193. Soon to be 194 when President Trump recognizes Somaliland. There's a big movement in Norway, right, for the independence of Somaliland and the recognition of Somaliland because of the oppression of the Somaliland people. No? It's a real thing. It's an actually very serious thing. It should be popular with people who believe in indigenous rights. So new countries are created fairly regularly, or out of collapse of federal entities like the Soviet Union or Yugoslavia, imperial dissolution, session, secession, divorce, like Czech Republic and Slovakia, just a pure split. There are different circumstances in which a new country. And so when you have a new country, it's very important to know what its borders are, because that's the basic thing of international law. International law is the rules that apply between countries. So you need to have some vague idea of what some good idea of what the country is. Now, again, usually when people say there's an international law says, you should start with skepticism. Why? Because there's no central body, right, that makes international law. Right? It's not the General Assembly, it's not the Security Council. It's not like you have a parliament here. They make laws, right? They make laws, the government votes on them, laws, laws, laws. Regulatory agencies, they make lots of regulations. You have none of that really in international law. So international law is much thinner than a domestic system. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but there's fewer rules. But for this, there's a rule, and it's not surprising that there's a good, serious rule for this, because this is a basic question for international law. Right? What are countries? How do you figure out what a country is? And again, the central concern of international law is reducing possibilities for conflict between countries. So not surprisingly, the rule for figuring out a new borders of a new country tries to be simple. So what would not be simple? Let's say history. If we said, let's go by history. Imagine Norway, your case. I don't know it very well. Right? But imagine if you said, borders of Norway are going to be determined by history. History when? 1750, 1814, what? Things change over it, right? How far back do you go? So history doesn't give you an answer, because history is long and contains many things. So the rule of international law is very simple. And this rule is applied to the creation of new countries around the world. I'll give you examples. And it is indisputably the rule for determining the borders of international law countries. If you open up a textbook in international law, what I'm saying is so unsophisticated, you will see like borders of countries, and it will say exactly what I'm saying. It may have a footnote, except for the unique case of Palestine. But this is the rule. Everyone agrees. And the rule for the world, at least, and I'm putting it in terms of the world because it's not controversial, is when a new country is created, its borders are inherited. It inherits the borders of the last top-level administrative unit in the area. The last top-level administrative unit in the area. What is a top-level administrative unit? I don't know what it is in Norway, but in America it is a state. In Canada, it's a province. In Germany, it's a land. In the Soviet Union, it was a Soviet Socialist Republic. So let me give you an example. Take Crimea, as Vladimir Putin did 10 years ago. No, doesn't work in Norwegian? Okay, it's a joke in English. The international community, including, I'm quite sure, Norway, strongly regards Crimea to be occupied Ukrainian territory. That's why Norway is constantly protesting the hundreds of thousands of Russian settlers that have moved into Crimea. They're not doing that? Okay, but anyway, they're there. And certainly Norway and the rest of the international community considers it occupied territory. So the question is, why do they treat it as Ukrainian territory? Even though today, everybody who lives there is Russian, because the Ukrainians left, or who wants to be part of Russia. It's run by Russia. Why? Is it because it's like a colonial thing? It's very far from Russia? So, no, it's in the middle. It's in between the two of them. Is it because of history? No, for most of history, the vast majority of history, it was part of Russia or its predecessors, the Russian Empire, and so forth. Is it because of this idea we always hear about the Palestinians' self-determination? Most people in Crimea probably wanted to be part of Russia. Not 90% like they said in the election that they organized. That's just the only number that comes out of a Russian ballot machine. But perhaps a majority, I think, would be safe to say. Maybe a narrow majority. So why can't they choose to be part of Russia? Rather, it's just this rule of international law. The Soviet Union was made of 16 Soviet socialist republics. Each had borders that were well known. Originally, Crimea was part of the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic, the biggest of them. Like I said, that has been the case for the past 300 years. In the 1950s, Nikita Khrushchev, who was the general secretary of the Politburo, the dictator, redrew the borders and gave Crimea to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, the second biggest, I think. He was from there. He wanted to do them some kind of favor. It didn't matter who did he ask? Really nobody. He didn't ask the Ukrainians. He didn't ask the Russians. And it didn't even matter to anyone so much because, in fact, all power was in the hands of the Kremlin in Moscow. But if you looked in 1989 at a map of the Soviet Union, you would see that Crimea is now part of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. Then comes independence. Both countries declare themselves independent. And under this rule, which, by the way, it's called the uti possidetis juris principle. It's Latin. They say this just to make themselves sound fancy, the international lawyers. But it means what I just said. So now, what is the border of Ukraine? It is the border of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic at the moment of its independence, i.e., including Crimea. Now note that this is not necessarily fair. Nobody has said anything. Because if you inherit the borders of the previous top-level administrative unit, it tends to be that those previous top-level administrative units in many places, in most places in the world, were not drawn fairly, democratically. Maybe there's no fair or democratic way. Certainly in the case of the Soviet Union, it had nothing to do with fair or democratic or self-representation or what anyone wanted. But that now becomes the borders of the Ukrainian country, even if most of the people in that area are not happy about it, because you don't go by the area, you go by the country as a whole. Good example? Okay. You guys have a border with Russia. You got to keep track of these things. That's the principle, and you can try it. And do you want another example before we turn to Israel? Yeah. Okay. Okay. So I understand that in Norway, occupation and settlers is taken very seriously and is seen as a troublesome thing, correct? And so certainly you must all be very familiar with the occupation of Azerbaijani territory in Nagorno-Karabakh. No? Okay. Another post-Soviet situation. There were two other Soviet socialist republics were Armenia, Christian, Azerbaijan, Muslim, and Azerbaijan much bigger than Armenia. And they're right next to each other. But there was a pocket inside of Azerbaijan, an enclave, called Nagorno-Karabakh, that was predominantly Armenian and had a long Armenian history and had been part of an Armenian kingdom at some point. Just a little bit over the border. That area, Nagorno-Karabakh, had a special autonomous status under the Soviet Union within the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. Everyone with me? Okay. You got to know these things. So most people in this place, Karabakh, were Armenian Christian people who wanted. When the countries became, when the Soviet Union started collapsing, the people in Karabakh wanted to join with Armenia. And they did not want to be with Azerbaijan, really, at all. Okay, but Azerbaijan said, no, look, you're technically inside our borders. Tough luck. And the Armenians said, but we're different. We have self-determination, we have a special autonomous whatever. Okay, so in the end, they had a war that started from before independence and lasted for several years. And the Armenians, or the country of Armenia, managed to take over Nagorno-Karabakh. And all the Azerbaijanis ran away. So that was the case. So from then on, from like 1991, all the people in this area in Nagorno-Karabakh are Armenians. There's 0 Azerbaijanis there because they ran away. And they all want to be part of Armenia. Everyone with me? And they're controlled by, there was never a day since the independence of Azerbaijan that it controlled this area of Karabakh. Okay, until 2 years ago. 20 years afterwards, let's say. More than 20. The Azerbaijanis had been preparing. And they launched an attack. And they kicked the Armenians out of Nagorno-Karabakh. Every single Armenian fled. There are now 0 Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh. So you can ask the government of Norway, does Norway consider Azerbaijan an occupying power in Armenia? And they probably wouldn't want to answer, but the answer really is no. And there's not a single country in the world, other than Armenia probably, that regards Azerbaijan as an occupying power. Why? They took over a territory that they had never controlled since their independence and where nobody wanted them. Because that territory was within the borders of the Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist Republic. In other words, they had sovereignty over it, and the fact that Armenia had been there does not change the sovereign rights of Azerbaijan. It's exactly the same case as Israel. It's exactly the same case. And so why is Azerbaijan not called an occupier? You can't occupy your own territory. But they never controlled it. Doesn't matter. Because this principle is stronger. So now let us turn finally to Israel. You see, I want you to be very suspicious of international law experts who don't know about Karabakh and Ossetia, etc. If you're an expert just about Israel, it's not international law, because international law requires more than one country. In the case of Israel, it's easy. It's undisputed. What was the previous top-level administrative unit? The League of Nations mandate for Palestine, mandatory Palestine. That was a distinct geopolitical entity. And there were other League of Nations mandates, Lebanon, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, were all mandates. And all of those countries took the exact borders of the mandatory territory at the time of independence. Even though it wasn't always fair or nice. For example, why do the Kurds not have a state? Because when they were making the mandate for Mesopotamia, as it was called, Iraq, there was some discussion of splitting it and creating a Kurdish state. But in the end, they didn't want to, for various reasons, to do with conflict between Turks and Arabs. That's it. Maybe the Kurds should have a state. And I assume Norwegian pro-independence activists are very, very on the case. But in fact, under international law, they do not have a state and don't have an entitlement to one. The same with the Druze in Syria, and so forth. The mandate for Palestine, if you were to ask anyone, Israel was declared independence in May 1948, if anyone asked in April 1948, what is this geopolitical entity? They would say Palestine, and its borders were absolutely clear, and they included what we would call today Israel, Jerusalem, Judea and Samaria, and Gaza. That was all one entity. So when Israel declared independence, it is entitled by international law to all those borders. Now people will say, oh, they didn't declare those their borders. Is that like a thing that countries do, declare borders when they gain independence? I mean, a few do, but it's actually very unusual. The United States didn't. I don't know. Does Norway's Declaration of Independence have like a map attached? It's unusual. Most countries do not do this. You don't need to do this. The point is, the international law automatically creates this border passing, the passing down of these borders. Now, it's true that Israel was immediately upon its independence, much like Azerbaijan, involved in a war for independence. In many invading Arab armies came in, and what were they trying to do? Prevent the creation of any Jewish state. Come in and Molotov-Ribbentrop, split it somehow. So we know, because we have a state of Israel, that they failed. But they only partially failed. Because they took parts of the territory that would fall under Israeli sovereignty, and they occupied it. That's what Jordan did in 1967. It occupied Judea and Samaria. Egypt occupied the Gaza Strip, and it's important to understand there was no such thing as the West Bank as a distinct entity, and there was no such thing as the Gaza Strip before 1948. The Gaza Strip, there's nothing strippy about it, right? It's not like a distinct There's like towns go all the way up down the coast. They don't stop at they don't stop at Gaza City. That goes Ashkelon, Ashdod. The Egyptian army was moving up north the coast, and they got most of the way to Tel Aviv. They were stopped at a couple of hard battles, Kibbutz Yad Mordechai and some other very dramatic confrontations. They were turned back. They didn't get to Tel Aviv, but they did get to right outside of Ashkelon, creating the Gaza Strip. That's what created it. It was simply that area of mandatory Palestine occupied by Egyptian troops, and the reason it's strippy is because they were moving in a column along the coast. Judea and Samaria, that weird West Bank looking thing, well, it goes through the middle of Jerusalem. That was not a map drawn by a normal person, right? Rather, the Jordanians attacked, and the Israeli forces managed to hold them up on the hill line, right, before they could come down this steep hill of the Judea and Samaria. And why was Jerusalem split? Because the old city has a wall, and the Jordanians took the old city. Israel couldn't retake it, but they took the rest of the city. That's why. And if you look at a map of the so-called 1949 armistice line, Jerusalem is like this little finger sticking in. Why does it look like that? Because it was literally a finger. They sent armored columns up a road to try to relieve Jerusalem, and were only partially successful. In other words, what is Judea? What is the West Bank? The West Bank is that area of mandatory Palestine illegally invaded and annexed by Jordan and ethnically cleansed of every single Jew. So now to say that the armistice agreement, what's an armistice agreement? It's a ceasefire. So people say, oh no, armistice agreement, it's like a treaty, you have to go by the armistice borders. That's what they say in the case of Israel, right? So everyone understands this green line was an armistice agreement. So people say that armistice agreement creates a new border. It would be very shocking to me if progressive Norwegians say that, because think what it would mean for the country next door. Putin would love for armistice agreements to define his border, because there's constant armistice agreement is just where the fighting has stopped. That's exactly what Putin says. We have where we stop, that's what we keep. No one, right? There's been 22 armistice agreements now with Russia and Ukraine, constantly. Doesn't mean they keep what's on the other side of the armistice agreement. So to say that the armistice agreement with Jordan creates a hard new legal reality, even after that armistice ends, because there's no armistice, because there's peace now, right? Israel made peace with Jordan, is to say that those areas made Judenrein by Jordan in 1949 must permanently stay Judenrein no matter under whose administration they come. That's a shocking proposition. And that's why people like to say settlements in violation of the Geneva Convention sounds much nicer than to say those areas of the biblical homeland, including Jerusalem, from which Jews were expelled in 1949, no one is even going to think that they're going to come back when it's under Arab control, but even if it comes under Israeli control, also, it's a permanent no-Jew zone. So, that doesn't sound very liberal. I don't know of any other context where such a proposition has been suggested. So, the territory is occupied by Jordan from 1949 to 1967, and in 1967 is like Israel's 2023, I think, 22. That's the Armenian, when Azerbaijan got the war, got Karabakh back. Right? They were much better prepared, they were better armed, and they retook this territory. One would expect the international community's reaction to be exactly the same as when Azerbaijan retakes Karabakh. You can't occupy. Or imagine what would Norwegians say if God works a miracle for the Ukrainians, that's what it would take, and they mount an offensive and retake Crimea? Would anyone say, you're occupying Crimea? But wait, it's not been theirs for a long time now. No one there is asking for them to come back. But you can't occupy your own territory. You can't occupy your own territory. So Israel, under international law, has sovereign rights over the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. It had sovereign rights over Gaza, but I think it's quite arguable that they gave them up when they left in 2005. They can now still re-exercise them, given the situation. That's a separate discussion. And because it's Israeli territory to which Israel has a sovereign claim, you can't talk about occupation. Because what is occupation? When you take the territory of another country, an enemy country. Not when you retake your own territory, or territory to which you have a colorable claim. You can't self-occupy. And if there's no occupation, then there's no discussion of settlements or anything like this. So that is the basic legal position. I've probably spoken for too long, and I know there should be questions. So, yeah. Conrad, you'll field the questions.
Thank you, Eugene. I was really looking forward to this.
Okay.
And I'm so happy I was here.
Oh, thank you.
So, we are getting questions, and if I get my it's turning up and down in my screen here. Well, okay. But what are the legal statuses of the Balfour Declaration and the San Remo Agreement with regards to the State of Israel and the borders? Very simple question. We need a short answer.
No, I can give it. So listen, my general view, it does not have any present, the Balfour Declaration has no legal value of any kind. It's a political declaration, right? It's a statement of the foreign policy of the United Kingdom. So it's an important statement, and it was a very friendly pro-Zionist statement, but it's not a legal document. San Remo was a legal document, but San Remo has no direct legal effect today. It has only an indirect legal effect. What do I mean? San Remo was about the creation and management of the Mandate for Palestine. 100 years ago. That mandate no longer exists because it has ended and a country has been created. So we don't look into what it says so much in San Remo for having binding legal force because it deals with a situation, namely a mandate, which is no longer in place. What the indirect significance is this. It creates a mandate, and that mandate was given borders by the British and the French in agreement with the League of Nations. Those borders are then inherited by the state that emerged in the mandate. In other words, Israel. So it was important by giving legal legitimacy to the mandate. The mandate had certain borders. Those borders become hereditary. I mean, it has historical interest. I think it's the only international agreement that actually uses the word settle or settler, because it says that Jews should be allowed to settle in the land, unlike what the Turks had been doing, which was not let them settle.
So, next question. How does the Geneva Convention relate to the status of the West Bank and Gaza and Israeli actions in these areas?
Okay, it's a good question. So I would say that you probably mean the Fourth Geneva Convention, which are about treatment of civilians in wartime. So again, the Geneva Conventions are not the Ten Commandments. What do I mean? I don't mean that they're not authoritative. I mean they don't apply in all places and all time, right? The Geneva Conventions is not a list of good things, right? It is a list of rules that apply in a certain situation. In particular, an international armed conflict. A conflict between two countries. What's the other country that Israel is having a conflict with? So there is none. Now, by the way, there was a view that was previously held that because there was a conflict with Jordan and the West Bank was taken as part of that conflict, the rules should apply even though the territory didn't belong to Jordan. And that view was articulated by Herbert Hansel, the State Department legal advisor under Jimmy Carter in 1977. And this was one of the famous arguments that Israel is occupying the territory. By the way, he did not address at all the argument I made here today about Uti Possidetis Juris. But even Herbert Hansel, who thought the Geneva Conventions do apply because there was an armed conflict with Jordan, said, if Israel should ever make peace with Jordan, which seemed impossible at the time, 1977. So it's always good to see what people say before something happens, not after, because after everybody knows how it turns out. So if it turns out that Israel makes peace with Jordan or Egypt, there would not be any more occupation, because you can't have occupation without an armed conflict. Right? For example, nobody considers Germany occupied by the United States, even though they've had troops there since 1945. Why? Because there's no armed conflict between them anymore. So Israel, of course, made peace with Egypt in 1979 and a full peace with Jordan in 1994. So either way, there's no relevance of the Geneva Conventions.
So 99% of discussions related to the Israelis, Palestinians, starts with taking occupied West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza as belonging to Palestinians by international law as granted. On what basis?
Oh, yeah. Listen, I think it has I don't think it has a great basis. I think, the tricks used to create this kind of argument include giving legal status to United Nations resolutions that they don't have, right? Because, look, the United Nations said 1,000 times, but they could say 1,000,000 times because it's not a law-making body. You could say there's an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, which is part of the United Nations also. But again, under the Charter of the United Nations, advisory opinions don't have legal status because nobody trusted this court to give them such powers. Now, in terms of occupation, it's very, very hard to understand. Now, I understand an argument that, just like you believe in a Kurdish state and a Druze state and a Somaliland state, you also want there to be a Palestinian state. But that's a normative argument. That's like I think it would be nice rather than international law requires.
And did the United Nations General Assembly condemn Egypt and Jordan's illegal occupation of Israeli territory between 49 and 67?
Never mentioned it.
Never mentioned it.
Or the fate of the Palestinians in the occupied territories.
Okay, so I have a question.
By the way, just to give you an idea,
okay.
I did a study on this once. This is out of date. This is maybe I did this 4 or 5 years ago. How many times has the United Nations referred to Israel as an occupying power since 1967? Now, I wrote this in a Wall Street Journal article. You can look it up for the exact numbers, but it's something like 2,400. How many times has it referred to Russia, Soviet Union, Turkey, Morocco, Vietnam, China, and every other country in the world as occupying powers since that period? 16 total. So there's like something very deep is going on, something that can't be considered normal.
You know, when you speak about these things in the Middle East, we are very far away from Norway. Mm-hmm. Most things actually are far away from Norway, to be true. And then you don't focus on the specific Norwegian perspective. And the Norwegian perspective is that large parts of Norway is now occupied by Sweden. That's true. I mean, Jämtland, Härjedalen, Bohuslän. Other parts are occupied by United Kingdom, like the Hebrides, Orkney Islands, I don't know what. So, but we have one place in this world where international law does come into consideration, and that is Svalbard and the Svalbard Convention. Now, if you don't apply the rules about, that you have now outlined about Israel and what you might call the territories, the way you say, what could that have?
So I'm not well versed enough in these territorial disputes to know what the basis of each side's claims are. Does Norway make a poteditis claim?
No. Actually, it was jokingly when it comes to Sweden and Orkney Islands, but Svalbard is based on the same framework that you came out of the Versailles treaties. And so if the Versailles Treaty is undermined, so to speak, by what they say about Israel, could that undermine the treaty for Svalbard?
So yes and no. Yes and no. One can say, and I often say this, people say, why should the borders of Israel be determined by San Remo? This was like dead white males 100 years ago, Versailles, imperial, colonial, why should we care? But if you throw that out, you also throw out every other border in the Middle East. So, and the entire existence of the countries of Lebanon and Jordan. Jordan was just a sub-paragraph within the Mandate for Palestine. The Mandate for Palestine created the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. So if we think that these, let's say, post-Versailles conventions are invalid today for some reason, they change not every border in the Middle East and many not in the Middle East.
Okay.
But that's one answer. But the second answer is, that's not really a serious argument, because when people make these arguments, they don't mean that these rules should be applied generally. They mean that there should be, it's what I call a legal ghetto. One little universe of rules for Israel, and then like the rest of the world will proceed according to the normal rules.
So we want to thank you so very much for this lecture. It is important, and it's very nice to have it in such a way that you present it in a way that even laymen think that we understand something about this. Now, Once upon a time, the peoples of the world were asked to write books about the elephant.
Yeah.
And the Americans made the book Bigger and Better Elephants. And the French made the book L'amour des éléphants. And the Germans made the book Eine kleine Einleitung des Lebens des Elefantes. The Norwegians made the book Norway and the Norwegians. And so this is a book about Norway.
Oh,
thank you very much for your excellent introduction. Thank you.
Da har vi et kvarters pause, men bare litt beskjeder. Følger dere nøye med nå? Vi må sjekke ut av hotellrommene våre innen klokken 12. Så hvis du ikke har gjort det, så bør du prioritere det nå i pausen. Og hvis du har ledig tid, så bør du kjøpe bøkene.